Israel-Palestine, and she is in Jerusalem. And what I thought we would do, oh, and just technically, I want everyone to know that you're all muted. I encourage you to participate in the chat, and you can send questions in the chat to us. And if we can, we will try to address them. I can't promise we'll address every question, but we'll try to address some of them. And I think that's all the technical stuff we need. And what I would like to do is ask Lubna, who's on the ground and also has teams in different places in Israel-Palestine that are covering the story for Middle East Eye. And if you don't know about Middle East Eye, all of us publish there. Shir does, I do, and Lubna is the bureau chief. So we encourage you to, I'm giving a shout out to Middle East Eye. It's middleeast.net online if you want to look afterwards. And so what I wanted to do was to ask Lubna to tell us, give us her impressions of everything that she knows that's going on. It's going to cover a pretty wide area because it's going to deal with what's happening inside Israel, and it's going to deal with what's happening in Gaza. And also I wanted to ask her to sort of summarize how we got to this place from the beginning of the tension and the conflict that started with Sheikh Jarrah. So go ahead, Lubna.
Yeah, first of all, I will give some main points, and later you can, ask people who are with us also can ask questions, and then we can go more in details. But before I speak, I want to say that Palestinian areas here are divided. Like West Bank is a separate area surrounded with a wall. Palestinians there have a different status. They have a Palestinian ID and a Palestinian and Jordanian passport. There's checkpoints between West Bank and Jerusalem, where the people in Jerusalem, they were speaking about 250,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem who have a residency, but actually they don't have a citizenship, and they're facing mainly eviction, settlements, and etc. We have 2 million Palestinians in Gaza who totally besieged, and they are disconnected since the 2000 from other areas of the West Bank, and they can't come in and out. This is all you know, but this Gaza is a city of Palestine. And we have about 2 million Palestinians inside Israel. We been called as Arab Israelis. Palestinians inside Israel like to call themselves Palestinian 48. We remain inside Israel since 1948. We are the Palestinians who stayed in our villages. And in order to stay in our villages, Israel imposed on us to hold an Israeli citizenship. That was it was a condition for us to stay in our lands. What's going on today is very significant because Palestinians are uprising in all the areas in Palestine, also in West Bank, also in Jerusalem, and in Gaza. We know that Palestinians under attack, and the significant things also in Palestinians 48 that, like inside Israel, that been considered until lately like citizens who are fighting for equal rights with Israel, but they've been neglected by international community. I come back to Jerusalem, and we started to cover and to follow the houses that been under eviction in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which is one of the neighborhoods around the old city of Jerusalem. The issue of Sheikh Jarrah began 15 years ago. 27 Palestinian families who originally refugees take these houses back in the 50s as instead of their houses they lost in 48, and they are facing a massive plan of eviction of their houses in order to give it for settlers who claim that they own the land much before the establishment of the state. In 2008, there were 4 families who were evicted. And back today, we had this El Kurd family and the Skafi family and other 2 families who are under eviction. And in August, there is another 4 families who were under eviction as well. The Sheikh Jarrah case wasn't new. Like every week there were protests. But mainly I could feel the vibe of anger of what's going on in Jerusalem in different places. The struggle of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood spread to the Aqsa Mosque. You probably noticed that there was a struggle also in Damascus Gate, in other areas in Jerusalem where the police decided not to allow Palestinians to sit in the stairs of Damascus Gate, which is the main exit of the old city. This is for me, wasn't only Sheikh Jarrah. It's a lot of things that been happening in different times that Palestinians felt it can't continue anymore like this. And we find the whole thing is spread to the Palestinian towns inside Israel, Akka, Haifa, Lud, Nazareth, and we find ourselves into a mass of demonstrations and uprising in all of historic Palestine. Also in the West Bank, there were 11 Palestinians who were killed by the Israeli army. We had dozens of protests in the West Bank in 48. When I say 48, I mean Palestinian towns inside Israel, if it's make you understand more. And of course, in Jerusalem, the confrontation over the houses in Sheikh Jarrah continue. I have to say that, for me, I'm a journalist. I'm running this office. This is the first time I find myself in this situation that all of Palestine is in uprising. All of the Palestinians are out. Usually I have something happening in Gaza and then I cover Gaza and sometimes Jerusalem. But this was very significant. And I must say that also I meet with a new generation in Palestine, a fearless generation who is not scary to pay the price and to protest, and they don't have anything to lose. It's just different from the first generation of the Nakba. It's different even from my generation. I meet 20 years old, 18 years old, 19 years old boys, women who are going out to the streets and they're not ready to accept the oppression, to accept to be Class B citizens in Israel. You probably aware of the nation law that giving supremacy to Jewish over Palestinians inside Israel. And all of these factors that been going like a snowball that happening, I would call it the silence occupation that been normalized also in the international community is exploding now in the face of everyone. I should say also that I feel a lot of hope among Palestinians here that they can make a difference. I don't see this as ending. I consider this as a turning point in our struggle. I also, one of the things I noticed among my meetings with also Israeli settlers, that there is also on the other side a generation, Israeli yeshiva boys, who also raise their head because they have now a representation by Kahanist groups in the Israeli Knesset. They're going in the streets, they call death for Arabs, none of them were arrested. They attack Palestinians, we call it lynching. And this is the situation at the moment. It's tomorrow there is a general strike in all of historic Palestine. This is the first time since 1936 that Palestinians unite their struggle and going for a general strike.
Lubna, why don't you talk a little bit about what happened at Al-Aqsa? Because I think that really had an impact in sort of lighting a fire in the community in terms of the border police entering it, defiling the holy site, and what happened there.
What happened, I was in the Aqsa in the night of all of what happened. And I mean, I met with the young Palestinians who slept there. In the morning, we thought, like Israel said, we will not let the settlers enter the mosque. So many just of my friends and colleagues relaxed and just thought it will be a calm day because it's a day before, like last night of Ramadan. But after half an hour, uh, hundreds of police and forced armed police entered the Aqsa, and it's like to look at the scenes and the amount of bombs and gas tears. There were hundreds of Palestinians who were injured. They entered the holy spaces, and it's felt like, if you look at the footage from that day, it's completely looked like a war. Israel could prevent that by simply not rock inside the Aqsa at that day. Of course, I think Netanyahu, the prime minister, wants this to reach to this level, also because of the election. But it's also one of the, again, it started from Sheikh Jarrah, it's moved to the Aqsa Mosque, and from the Aqsa Mosque, the Gaza Strip, and then was no way back from all of this.
Right. Thank you, Lubna. And feel free to join in as we talk, if you have anything to add on the ground to what we're going to be talking about.
I just want to add,
Yep,
Richard,
go ahead.
that the scene today, I just want to add that the scene today is really, it's shocking. If you come to the Palestinian cities inside Israel, you see endless amount of police, مستعربين, private forces in everywhere. It's remind people of military time. There's more than 1,000 people were arrested, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I feel like we are into a new era of a new period of time that it would going to be very not easy for Palestinians here.
It seems like to me it goes back to 1966 or beforehand, where
Yes,
you had the
military.
we had military rule in the Palestinian communities inside Israel. I assume there were curfews and all sorts of impositions of limitations of rights. And there was a case in Yaffo, I think in Ajami, or maybe it was just in Yaffo, where Israeli Jews were trying to show their support for the Palestinians and were chanting slogans like Arabs and Jews will not be enemies. And they were met by, you mentioned this sort of like vigilante groups that are being empowered by either by the police or by the internal security ministry, not wearing uniforms, not wearing name tags, not identifying themselves. And so there's this wild, crazy mix of official police and border police, and then you talked about mistarvim, which we should describe as Israeli Jews police who are dressed as Palestinians in order to catch individual Palestinians that they want to arrest, and they go into protests among the Palestinian communities dressed as Palestinians and then arrest these people and take them away. So it's a very strange, terrifying experience, I would imagine, for Palestinians in these communities. They don't know who is out there. And not only that, but at night, I've been reading about the roving gangs of vigilantes who are sweeping through the streets and looking for Arabs to beat up and trying to violently crash their way into homes, and God knows what. There's lots of videos of that out there. So it's just an especially terrifying time, I think, for not just for the Palestinians, but for Jews as well, because there was violence as well by Palestinians. So it's like every community is now experiencing, the Jewish community in these towns is now experiencing something of what Palestinians on the West Bank experience every night when the army comes in and arrests people, at 3 a.m. in the morning. But I wanted to move to Shir now and have Shir talk about some of these same issues about this extraordinary tension and conflict and maybe even civil war that's happening, that's tearing apart Israeli society at the seams. So take it from there, Shir.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the fact that the fear is something that is not exclusive to the Palestinian community. I think it's very important what you said, Lubna, about this new development of Palestinian unity, where we see resistance coming from Jerusalem, from the so-called mixed cities like Lod and Akka and Jaffa and Haifa. And we see, of course, the people in Gaza rising up and in the West Bank, and all at the same time. This is a mirror image of, but an opposite mirror image of what's happening in Israel, where you see the opposite of unity. You see the most divided moment in Israeli history, in Israeli society ever. And of course, people are afraid, but what we see is that Palestinians, despite being afraid, are rising up with a straight back and fighting back against impossible odds. But we see that the Israelis are acting in a panic. One of the reasons that these lynch mobs and pogroms are happening is because the government, the police, the authorities are afraid to try to stand between them and their Palestinian victims, because then they would maybe lose their ability to govern their own population. But if they allow these lynch mobs to act, they're losing their ability to have a sovereign state. In fact, the Israeli military has deteriorated to a mob-like state, like an angry mob, and soldiers are acting very, very individually and not following orders. As a result of this, you see that the Israeli security forces are stretched very, very thin along the different fronts. Just recently, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said that he's going to cancel the Palestinian elections that have been so anticipated and waited for so long. And this was maybe expected, but it was still very disappointing. And a lot of Palestinians say, well, if he's just going to cancel the elections, and of course, the reason for canceling the elections is that the Israeli government said they're not going to allow these elections to take place in Jerusalem, thereby breaking the Oslo agreements. But nevertheless, Palestinians in the West Bank see, well, there is not going to be election. There is no democratic or semi-democratic representation for us under any kind of institution. Why do we need the Palestinian Authority anymore? Can you imagine what's going to happen if the Palestinian Authority collapses? If just a lot of people will say, it's not worth it for us, for maybe a small paycheck that sometimes comes, sometimes not, to continue to be the subcontractors of the Israeli occupation. Will the Israeli military be able to find hundreds of thousands of troops to take over the West Bank and manage it in the same way that was managed until the 90s? I don't think so, but they have no choice, because otherwise what's going to happen? Palestinians are able to win their freedom so easily, so the same thing is going to happen in Gaza, and the same thing is going to happen in Haifa. And this is why you see now the Israeli government, the Israeli public, the Israeli newspapers are speaking in a language of doom. They're talking out of fear. And I think this violence that we're seeing against Palestinians, this racist violence, is motivated by fear. And Netanyahu, Lubna, you said it very well. Netanyahu started this very, very intentionally. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that he was doing that on the nights of Al-Qadr that are so important for the people praying in Al-Aqsa Mosque. And he knew that he intentionally expanded the violence from Sheikh Jarrah to also include the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And he did that effectively to prevent the opposition from forming a government. But at what cost? You know, if I can say a word or two about what's happening in the Israeli society about this, what kind of other perspectives are within the Israeli society? Like you said, Lubna, the Sheikh Jarrah story has been going on for a long time. Even 15 years ago, when there were demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah, and I participated in those demonstrations, I didn't feel very happy in those demonstrations because some of the protesters were left Zionists. They didn't come there because they cared about the rights of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. They came to oppose the evictions, the deportation of families from their homes, because they said, if we recognize the right of Jews over property that was lost in the War of 1948, then millions of Palestinian refugees are going to demand the property that they lost in the same war of 1948. So it's rational for us to give up all claims on Sheikh Jarrah. Otherwise, we'll create a dangerous precedent. So this kind of rational Zionist logic is something that has been always very opposed to Netanyahu, right? This is people saying it's better to make some small compromises in the short term in order to maintain a Zionist domination and superiority over the entire territory for as long as possible. Netanyahu has always been a person for the short term and always didn't care very much about what kind of price will have to be paid for him to stay in power personally and to get some deal here and there. And I think that's something that has really been a mark of his entire very, very long administration. He's now more than 13 years Prime Minister of Israel. And back in 2002, his wife gave an interview, Sarah Netanyahu, and she said in the interview, if Netanyahu is not going to be the prime minister, we will just leave the country and the country can burn for all I care. And that statement is now being recalled in Israeli media because the country is burning. And because people are saying, well, actually, Netanyahu's overplayed his hand. He doesn't care what the consequences are going to be. He doesn't care if it means that he has to start a war in Gaza and in the West Bank and inside Israel at the same time. He's going to do that because that's what it takes to keep him as the prime minister. But that also could spell a change in the very political system in Israel-Palestine. It could be the end of apartheid. And that's why a lot of Israelis are very much afraid. Their privileges are at stake. And that makes these events very interesting, and we should really be following them very closely. But of course, everyone are looking at what's happening in the United States. And I think President Biden proved himself to be surprisingly progressive on many issues. But here, when it comes to Palestine, suddenly there seems to be the same old pro-Israeli rhetoric that we're hearing. And maybe, Richard, there's more that you can tell us about what's going on there.
Thank you, Shir. That was a great introduction for me to come in. But before I talk about the U.S., which is an important part of this, I wanted to expand what we've been talking about because it's very not mentioned at all or understood the role that there's a regional dimension here that we haven't really discussed, and that is that several rockets were fired from Lebanon into northern Israel, into the Mediterranean. They didn't land in Israel, and several rockets were fired from Syria into Israel. And not only that, but I have an Israeli security source who I reported in my blog told me that Iran has supplied, and this is not news because Victor Lieberman revealed this a year ago, that Iran has supplied Hamas and Islamic Jihad with cruise missiles for the first time. And these are a much more advanced form of weaponry than the primitive missiles that they have been using until now. And that is one of the reasons the Iron Dome is not capable of tracking cruise missiles, or at least it does a much poorer job than it does with the other types of missiles. So that's one of the reasons why so much damage relative was done to Israel compared to 2014, when Iron Dome was able to intercept many of these missiles, or they landed in areas which weren't populated and caused no damage. And so far, the last I checked, there were 10 Israelis that have been killed by these missiles. So you have Iran, which has its own beef with Israel because Israel has engaged in sabotage internally inside Iran, assassinating nuclear scientists and causing major explosions in the Natanz nuclear facility. So Iran has its own agenda here and has been engaged with the Palestinian resistance, militant resistance, in trying to retaliate against Israel. So This has really been in the background, but I think we need to keep in mind that if things get worse, and they always can get worse in the Middle East, something like this could really light a match and cause a conflagration that goes throughout the region. But now I'd like to sort of turn back to the foreign element here of how the world has reacted to this. And I think that almost everyone hopes that if there's no ability internally in Israel to stop this mayhem, that the world, the international bodies, the United Nations, the EU, and the US, which is Israel's most important ally, would step in some way and try to stop the bloodshed. And I'm reminded of what happened in Srebrenica in the former Yugoslavia, and what happened in Rwanda, as the world stood by and refused to intervene for whatever reasons. It couldn't organize itself. It couldn't get the kind of moral cohesion that's necessary to step in and decide to take concrete, definitive action to intervene and stop an atrocity, genocide like those two that I mentioned. And I think something like that is happening now. And I think we see the same exact inability to act, sort of moral paralysis that's happening in the United States with Biden. I was reading yesterday night that our UN ambassador, who's supposedly a progressive African-American woman, for the third time has vetoed UN Security Council resolution proposed by 3 or 4 of the members of the Security Council. We are paralyzed. And we do have some voices in Congress that are calling for action. We have the Squad, we have the progressive sort of caucus in the House, and we have unfortunately just about only Bernie Sanders calling for something that's much more definitive than just kind of the we're concerned and Israel has the right to self-defense, which is the mantra that we're hearing from Biden himself. But even there, I think that progressives are pulling their punches. They're not calling for an end of U.S. Military aid to Israel, which is where we should be. Until now, we've had Betty McCollum's legislation, which proposes to condition Israeli U.S. aid to Israel based on it adhering to international law. Her main agenda is to stop the arrest of children, Palestinian children, of whom I think there are 300 in violation of the Geneva Conventions. Minors, 300 have been arrested by Israel and are held by Israel. So those are sort of like the tiny baby steps, getting away from the previous kind of pro-Israel agenda that the House and Congress have followed until now. But I think the direction that things have to go is there has to be this continuing opening, this continuing deterioration of the former consensus, the pro-Israel consensus, the Israel lobby imposed on the House and the Senate and on the presidency. And I think Biden is reverting to that old sort of consensus, and he's been a pro-Israel warrior going back to 1972 when he was first elected. And as Shir said so well, I think the progressives were willing to give him a chance and see what he was going to do, because he seemed to have a progressive domestic agenda, but I don't think many progressives believed that on Israel they were going to see anything that would be able to be seen as positive. And unfortunately, our worst expectations have been realized. And that's one of the reasons I couldn't vote for him, because I knew that this would be the impact. I knew that there would be nothing happening over the next 4 or 8 years if he's in power. And I also knew that when there's a vacuum of leadership in the region, everything doesn't stay the same and the status quo doesn't remain the same, but actors come in to play and have their own agenda. And this is the mess that ends up happening. So I'm really depressed and shocked. I shouldn't say shocked because it's what I expected, but I'm still shocked at the level of bloodshed and the complete inability to take any sort of positive action by President Biden. It's just shameful. And I think that we as Americans, the people who are in the audience here, need to pressure our senators and our congressmen. I did see that I believe 32 of the 50 Democratic members of the Democratic caucus in the Senate called for a ceasefire. I don't know what the other 22 were thinking. I guess they are waiting to get their marching orders from AIPAC. But at least that's some tiny incremental bit of movement here. But the problem is that events on the ground move so fast and deteriorate so fast that that what we're doing here in the United States is way behind the curve in terms of what needs to be happening, and we're just completely out of the loop and have no impact, and it's just very sad and depressing. I think here for progressives.
What about apartheid? Because Biden prides himself for being opposed to apartheid, or maybe even one of the first in the Democratic Party that spoke openly against apartheid. And then this year we had the biggest human rights organization in Israel, B'Tselem, and now Human Rights Watch calling Israel an apartheid state, I think very accurately. I also think that when Palestinian organizations already called Israel an apartheid state for years, they were ignored. That's also part of the problem, and maybe part of the reason that apartheid exists not just inside the state of Israel, but also in the perception of Israel in the United States. But why didn't we see Biden saying that he's going to be hard on apartheid the same way that he was before?
Well, I think this goes to the issue of human rights. And for some strange reason, people have been talking about Biden's foreign policy as having a human rights dimension. And we see that maybe it will have that in some areas. But in Israel, we just see a total reversion to the same old, same old. You can go back and look at every major Israeli military operation, and there's been total uniformity in the US. We've been willing to supply the weapons when the Israeli military has been running out of weapons when they went to war in Lebanon, and we immediately shipped the weapons to them. So as far as Israel, there is no human rights agenda. But the positive, there are positive elements here, I should say, amidst the catastrophe. And that is exactly what Shir just said about Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem for the first time ever calling Israel an apartheid state, not just in the West Bank, which is obviously it was, but also calling the Israeli state itself as apartheid. And B'Tselem pointedly said, this is apartheid from the river to the sea. I think that's an extremely important part of this, which is saying that this is one whole system that exists inside of Israel itself and in the West Bank. And it gets to the point that the only possible way to, in the long term, to resolve this is by having a single unitary state that incorporates all of those areas into one state. If there ever is going to be a sort of normality in Israel-Palestine, it has to be a state that is going to incorporate all of these people and giving them equal rights. That's the only way to go. It may take generations to get there, hopefully not. But that really is the way to go. And I think BDS, and I think the increasing ability to talk about apartheid, and even people are now using the term genocide, which used to be kind of almost taboo to talk about. And people who use this term genocide were seen as kind of outliers, and people were able to say, this is not genocide, and that don't compare this to, the N-word, the Nazis and the Holocaust. I think that we're getting closer and closer to doing that, and that, in turn, I think exacerbates the what we've been talking about here, which is an increasing ostracism of Israel and increasing awareness outside of Israel, at least among progressives around the world, that that this is untenable, and that the direction that it has to go is the ones that we've been talking about here. We can no longer, liberal Zionists no longer have any kind of credibility, although they keep trying to put forward their two-state solution. And you were talking about Sheikh Jarrah and liberal Zionists, Israeli left Zionists. I think that's a a train that's left the station a long time ago, and it is collapsing. The Labor Party, barely exists as a kind of former center left inside Israeli politics. I don't know where this is going. It's all very new, but the cracks are massive, and we'll have to wait and see what the long-term impact is of this inside Israel and also externally and in the region.
If
I have
it's
to
okay,
add,
I wanted to ask Lubna a question. Actually, Lubna, I think that this debate about where things are going, I'm trying to follow what's happening in the Israeli media now, and I think that if we look at the last couple of years, there was an increase in the representation of Palestinians, especially Palestinians 48, in Israeli media. Very slow, and it's still, there's very clear discrimination. But now, if you're looking at what's happening in the last couple of days, there's just no guests, no Palestinian 48 guests being invited to speak on the media. And if they are, the first thing is that they're asked, first of all, you have to condemn what Palestinian violence, and you have to, in a very patronizing, aggressive kind of voice. What do you think? Does this mean that all of the achievements in the media have been lost? Or
I don't think there was any achievements in the Israeli media. We always played the role in the media that Israel wants us to serve, to be the good Arab, to speak, to invite Palestinians, Arabs who speak the terminology that Israel wants. We've been always invited to condemn things. We never really had an equal voice in the Israeli media. It probably is a fantasy or something, is an illusion. I would say now we are in, there is no way in the middle. The scene is very clear. It's a black and white. There is no maybe, there's no gray area. There is no illusions about having representation in the Israeli parliament or in the Israeli media. And I think we reached a place where everything is out. The racism is out, the discrimination is out, the hatred of the Arabs inside Israel and the Palestinians is out. And here it's something else will start, and nothing hidden anymore under the table.
I wanted to also add one dimension that I forgot to talk about, and that is the International Criminal Court. They, about 4 to 6 months ago, they announced that they were starting a formal inquiry into Israeli war crimes that were going to go back to 2014, which was Operation Protective Edge. And they were going to take I don't know the time limit that was going to be imposed on this investigation, but the chief prosecutor, Bensouda of the criminal court, made a very interesting statement about a week ago, and she said, "We're watching. We are watching these developments." It doesn't seem to have had any impact on Israel itself. Israel continued to massively destroy the AP and Al Jazeera media offices, and then they yesterday destroyed the home of Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas. But I think it's very important to add this dimension that the ICC could, at some point in the future, actually file formal charges against Israel. There could be a formal trial in The Hague. There could be indictments of Israeli leaders who are sitting in power, like Netanyahu or like Kochavi, who's the chief of staff. These people could have international criminal indictments against them. So I want to add
Richard,
that.
I think there's a very big impact of the ICC decision to open the investigation with the attack that we're seeing now? Absolutely, because you have to see it from the Israeli point of view to understand why the Israeli attack on Gaza is actually a response to the ICC in many ways. You see, the ICC made very strong arguments, and the accusations are very severe and also very well documented. And from the beginning, the Israeli government made it very clear they have no defense against those accusations. There is no attempt by the Israeli government to say, oh, we haven't committed war crimes. No, the only thing is to say the ICC has no jurisdiction because Palestine doesn't count as a state, and the ICC is biased, or the ICC, we don't recognize its authority and we refuse to sign the Rome Statute of the ICC. These are the only arguments. And with these arguments, Netanyahu tried to convince his voters that he can protect soldiers from being indicted and arrested. And then nothing happened because the ICC dragged its feet for so long. And I think that is something that didn't go here or there. A lot of Israelis are wondering, so is it over with the ICC, or is it still going to happen, and is it going to happen next week? And because Netanyahu needs some kind of result, he wants to say, look, we can do whatever we want and there are no consequences. That is the only way that he could convince the public that the ICC is not able to affect Israelis in any way. Then he has to actually commit war crimes. So it's not a coincidence. There are war crimes being committed. There are very lethal attacks on purely civilian areas in the Gaza Strip. And there are shocking and horrifying pictures of children being killed by Israeli bombs. And the Israeli soldiers who are committing those crimes know, or at least they are being told by the government, you have nothing to worry about.
Yeah, I think that I agree that basically Netanyahu is telling the world that we don't give a, I don't know if I could say this, but we don't give a shit about the ICC. We don't give a shit about what anybody cares. But the fact of the matter is that the world does have a lot of, could have a lot of power and impact here, especially the United States. As I mentioned, we give $3.8 billion, mostly in military aid, to Israel over a 10-year period. This was negotiated by the liberal progressive President Obama, who was trying to get Netanyahu to tone down his opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. So he gave this 10-year, $40 billion deal to Israel. We could just turn off that spigot, and that would have a huge impact inside of Israel. And we could tell Israel that we're not going to supply, we're not going to continue the military alliances, the military cooperation that's created weaponry like Iron Dome. And that would have a huge impact because we are the major, most powerful ally that they have, and they need us. And they pretend that they don't need us, but I think that they really do. But unfortunately, we may never know what kind of, this is a theoretical statement that I'm making, but I think that practically it could happen, and hope that it will happen eventually, but apparently not yet.
I think we have also to consider the growth of solidarity in the streets with the Palestinian case. I mean, from one side, we see the different, presidents like Biden, who in fact can stop the war, but he's not. He's giving Israel all the time to punish Hamas, and the number of people who are being killed every day is rising. But alongside with the fact that leaders are being ignorant for what's going on with the Palestinians, we're witnessing a growth of solidarity with among people in different countries in the international community. We've seen 150,000 people in London yesterday, in Paris and San Francisco. I heard also about big marches. And I think this, the protest and the uprising of the Palestinian, alongside with the courage, with a little bit more courage of the international community, can make a big difference for Palestinian liberation and freedom.
Yeah, here in Seattle, which is a relatively small community compared to other major cities, but we had nearly 5,000 people protesting yesterday and marching for Palestine. And a few days earlier, there were rallies, pro-Israel rallies in different cities, and there were 40 people protesting in Bellevue in favor of Israel. So I think that the fact that we brought out 5,000 people compared to the 40 that they were able to bring out is an indication of where the sentiment lies and in the streets. Even if in the halls of power we haven't yet been able to make enough of a dent, and I think that's an indication of where the direction that things will go. The streets start first. The sentiment there has a gradual impact of working its way from the bottom up to the top. And I think this development of the squad and now about 10 members of the squad elected to the House who take these positions that are far outside of the previous sort of moderate democratic pro-Israel agenda. I think that's all pretty hopeful. I just hope that things don't deteriorate so badly that by the time they have are able to have a major impact, that it'll be too late. Maybe we
There's an
should try to,
interesting connection between the two things that we just mentioned, the military aid to Israel and the protests on the street and public opinion and the tension between them. So, Richard, I actually don't quite agree with the way that you've presented the U.S. military aid to Israel, because the memorandum of understanding that Obama signed with Netanyahu for $38 billion over 10 years was actually not an increase, but a decrease in military aid to Israel, because you have to take into account inflation. And in fact, that was very pointed out by the Israeli arms industries, which said, there was a clause in the U.S.-Israeli arms agreement that allowed Israeli companies to make use of some of the aid money to sell their own goods to the Israeli government. So it was a subsidy to the Israeli arms industry, but Obama canceled it and made sure that all of the money goes only to U.S. companies. And actually, so this actually caused a very interesting strife between Netanyahu and the Israeli arms industries, because the Israeli arms industries were saying to Netanyahu, your populist policies that are turning U.S. public opinion against us are costing us money. But now, just before the most recent round of elections in Israel, that was, just a couple of weeks ago, Netanyahu forced the government to approve 2 more arms deals with the United States. And these 2 arms deals for F-35s and to replace the entire fleet of helicopters in the Israeli military are worth billions of dollars. Not 1 cent of that is financed by the military aid. That's in addition. And this is very problematic because there is no functioning government in Israel. There is no government budget. He had to bend the rules and take loans in order to finance it. And I think maybe this major arms deal played a certain role in getting the Biden administration to, just a big fat bribe to get the Biden administration to oppose public opinion on the streets and to take an unpopular position in the United States, pro-Israel and against Palestinians.
maybe we should try to look at the chat and see if there are any questions we could answer. I don't know if Lubna and Shir are able to see the chat.
Yes, and I did see something that was interesting to comment about, but Lubna, do you want to go first?
Please go ahead, Shir.
Sure. So I see that somebody shared the UN definition of genocide, and I think that is something that addresses directly what you said, Richard, about maybe starting to use that word and whether it's relevant or not. And I think this is something that we need to be very careful about, because first of all, the UN definition of genocide was written by 2 Jewish lawyers after the Second World War. And that's part of the reason that this definition was accepted by the UN, even though anyone who reads that definition would say, well, this is a little broad. Because when we think of genocide, we really think of mass murder. But the UN definition would also say that things like erasing a culture, changing street names, erasing the history of a people is also counted as genocide. If this is how you define it, then of course Israel has been implementing genocide against Palestinians for 73 years. But I don't like this definition at all, and I don't think that this is what we mean when we use that word. And I think that, of course, it is scary to look at those lynch mobs conducting pogroms, because if we think about these lynch mobs and pogroms as something that is similar to what happened in Europe in the 1930s that led up to genocide, where millions of people were murdered, then of course, if we can just follow that logic, and a lot of Israelis think in that association, because that is part of the Israeli education system that is really teaching a lot about the Holocaust, not in a very inclusive way, in a very exclusive way, just the Jewish Holocaust, but not the other people who were murdered. But still, that's something that this association is very deeply embedded in Israeli culture and Israeli history. But I don't think that we need to necessarily make that comparison. I think what you said about Serbia, for example, is another example of a situation in which ethnic strife between different groups has turned into genocide, because one group felt that they have all the power and they have the majority, and the others could be just swept out of the way if we do it quickly enough. But that's not the case in Israel-Palestine. The case in Palestine is that Jews are already a minority in the country, and they know that. And they don't have the ability, certainly not the international legitimacy, to go about and just depopulating Palestine from Palestinians, not by murder and not by deportations. And we're still, I mean, of course, the numbers of the dead, the people killed in Gaza rises every hour as we're speaking. I'm too afraid to give a number because I'm sure it will be outdated by the time I say it. But we still have to take these numbers in proportion and remember that it's not what limits the number of killings in Gaza and also in other places of Palestine is not the lack of bullets or the lack of missiles for the Israeli military. What limits it is the lack of willingness. And that is something very important, that the Israeli soldiers are not willing to commit every crime, and they're not willing to pay a price for those crimes. They're not willing to be confronted with international boycott. They're not willing to be banned from traveling to Europe. And they want a luxus occupation, right? They want to eat the cake and have it too. And they're not willing to make the sacrifices that the Serbians were willing to make during the Yugoslavia war. So I don't think that we're getting to the point of genocide quite yet.
But I do think, Shir, that we have a lot of the components that we saw in Germany in the 30s in place. And what you said is true. In that there is a sort of balance in population between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, but you know, the Israeli Jews do have a massive amounts of power. And inside Israel, the Palestinians are considered a minority. And I just feel like we have a situation where all the components of genocide are coming together gradually and may not have sort of coalesced in a way that would allow the process to proceed in the way that it did in the Holocaust. And it may never get to that point, but we sure do have so many of those components. You know, Kristallnacht, if you think about, you know, what that was like for Jews in Germany, and you think about what it's like for Palestinians, the only difference is that the Jews in Germany were such a minority they couldn't really fight back, and the Palestinians in Israel are not going to go quietly. So there is going to be pushback, but I'm afraid of there being too many similarities to 1930s Germany. Anyone else want to say anything? Look through the chat, see if there were any questions. I don't hear anybody speaking. Did we lose, can everybody hear?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's a question here about the basic law of the Knesset that says that candidates cannot run for election if they refuse to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And I think that is an important law to mention because it does mean that Israel has never been a democracy. This law means that that any non-Jewish candidate who would say, I also want to be a full citizen of that country is prevented by a basic law. And a basic law is the closest thing that the state of Israel has to a constitution. It's not really a constitution. But of course, we have, Lubna, you mentioned at the beginning, the nation-state law. Nation-state law is the official name. Nobody calls it that in Israel. They call it the law of the nation. And it's a law that was, it's a very short law, by the way. It's 200 words, very, very brief text, doesn't mention the word equality once, doesn't mention the word democracy once. And it mentions, however, all of the ways by which the Israeli government imposes inequality and apartheid on Palestinians, how Palestinians can never have national rights, they can only have basic citizen rights, not all of them, and that colonization is a basic tenet of the government responsibility, colonization of Jews. It says that very clearly in this text. And a lot of people said, well, maybe this law, the basic law of the Knesset, and now the law of the nation, they are proof that Israel is an apartheid state, is no longer a democracy, and so on. But I think that they are exactly what we're seeing now, this wave of blatant racism. What you said, Lubna, racism is now open, it's on the table. Because as long as it's possible to hide the racism and to say, well, there's been a curfew or there's been an arrest, but it was for security reasons and it's just a state of exception. It's not open policy that Palestinians are treated differently than Jews, but it just happens this way here and there. But the law doesn't justify it. If this is the kind of racism that you have, it shows that the Israeli government is still in control and is still able to pretend to be a democracy. And now it is not pretending anymore. It's very, very open and outright with the discrimination. I think it's because it has lost the ability to exert its power in a subtle way. And the moment where it has to exert its power so brutally and openly, it means that it is no longer sovereign. It loses its power, really. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing, that the state of Israel is really breathing its last in many ways. And it could be a regime that is going to be removed within a few short years.
I wanted to also talk about the Jewish democratic element here that Shir mentioned. The Declaration of Independence talks about Israel as a Jewish democratic state, and I think that liberal Zionists have held that out as their mantra for decades, and seen that as some kind of amalgam of Jewish values and democratic values that could inhere in the state itself. And I think that we're now finding that that's an illusion. And that is why the underpinnings of liberal Zionism, which have been so important in diaspora Jewry and so important in American Jewry, are gone. The illusion is gone. There is no possibility that Israel can be a democratic state as it's currently constituted. It's a Jewish state, and I'm really uncomfortable in a way as a Jew talking about Israel as a Jewish state in these terms, because it's a type of Judaism that I don't recognize. And I grew up in conservative Judaism, and I grew up in sort of infused with Jewish values. And so this is a Judaism I don't recognize, and I have a great deal of difficulty talking about whatever is Jewish in this. And in fact, I like to talk about the version of Judaism that Israel is offering as kind of pagan idolatry and the worship of what I call stones and bones, rather than the prophetic Judaism, universal values that of the Judaism that I think most Jews outside of Israel have practiced. But anyway, I think that democracy is really completely gone by the wayside, and that's the nation-state law basically sealed the doom of any possibility. Israel, wasn't democratic before then, but I think that, as Shir said, it's sort of like it sort of formalized the fact that democracy was dead in Israel, and so I suppose you can call it maybe an ethnocracy, in that Jews as an ethnic group have superior values. I mean, superior values, and also enjoy some democratic rights if they're the right Jews. But democracy is dead in Israel. I think we have to recognize that, and I think we have to fight back against the liberal Zionists in the media who are continuing to talk about this as a viable concept, and continuing to talk about two states and all the other rigmarole that goes on. Let's see if there are any other questions that we want to talk about in the chat. Oh, and maybe we should also talk about the destruction of the media office in Gaza, because I think that goes to the ICC investigation, and the Israel destroyed the media offices for many media outlets that were in Gaza, including Associated Press and Al Jazeera, and gave them an hour notice to evacuate, and then destroyed the building. And I think what's important here is that the AP is demanding an independent investigation of this crime. And I don't know enough about the Geneva Convention to say whether the deliberate destruction of attack on the free press is a war crime. But I imagine that when the Associated Press very decisively demands an investigation, that is really a signal to the ICC to include it in its brief, the investigation of war crimes going back to 2014. So I think this is also a kind of a marker that broke many people watching this when they realized that Israel would deliberately attack the free press because it didn't like the reporting that was happening. It didn't like seeing the videos that the world could see of the buildings being destroyed. So this may have been a decisive element in whatever's going to happen. Hopefully a ceasefire coming, who knows when, but.
I think, Richard, it also was confusing because, like, we also, Middle East Eye have offices at that building, and we released a statement about that. But then, like, Israel using all the time this excuse that Hamas is hiding in these buildings, and whatever, yes or no, it will not be a reason to just destroy such a buildings of a press or of any other buildings. And we find ourselves, like today, as a journalist, how you reply to that? What is your, what's your statement against that? How you use, like, Israel have its own explanation of why they're doing X, Y, Z, and what you will reply for this?
Well, the way I always reply is that they're lying, because you can almost always assume that when something like this happens, the Israelis are lying. And I always demand to see the evidence. And I think I read in some article that Israel has not presented any evidence that there was any Hamas presence. And the AP itself is basically alluding to that by saying they were never told there was a Hamas presence in the building. And I'm sure if the AP or Al Jazeera had heard beforehand that there was a Hamas presence in the building, they would have either left the building, or they would have appealed to Hamas to get out of the building. Because I think.
Do you think that Israel will Do you think Israel will shoot and destroy the building of the offices of the AP without telling them before that?
Oh, you mean, yeah, exactly. That's another point. Yeah, I think Israel would have told the AP and Al Jazeera, you know, there are Hamas.
No, I mean, like if the Americans did know about the bombing that coming into Gaza and agreed for that.
Oh, if America knew that they were going to destroy the building?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sure America knows everything. That, I mean, they have the NSA that's listening to everything that's going on. I'm sure they know exactly what Israel intends to do before they're going to do it. And I'm sure they could have released a statement beforehand, even if they weren't going to say, we know that you're going to do X, Y, or Z. I'm sure they could have released a statement saying, we warn Israel not to exceed, you know, red lines and not to attack whatever. And the fact that they didn't, it's sort of collusion between Biden and the Israelis, whether it's tacit or explicit. So yeah, it's cynical. But I don't think that if Israel had evidence that Hamas was there, it would have presented it. It would have presented videos, or it would have presented audio tapes. And Israel, the Unit 8200 of the Signal Intelligence Unit, knows everything that's going on in Gaza. They know every word that everybody is saying there, including probably of Hamas. So they could listen to everything that was happening in that building, including whatever the AP was saying and what Al Jazeera was saying. So I think it's just a tissue of lies. And Shir and I were talking about the trickery that the IDF attempted to lure Hamas into tunnels by claiming to the media that they had entered Gaza about a week ago or so, and they hadn't entered, and they wanted to see if Hamas would send its fighters into the tunnels. And it was a deliberate lie, and the mainstream media, including Shir was telling me the German media, reported that Israel had invaded Gaza. But Hamas didn't fall for the trickery, and Israel bombed those tunnels thinking they were going to kill 400 or 500 Hamas fighters, and they didn't kill anyone. So I think the lesson that should be learned, or should have been learned by the media, is never to trust anything that the Israeli government is telling them, especially the Israeli military, and that they have no credibility, and anyone who believes them is a fool. So that's what I would, in response to Lubna, that's what I would say. I don't know if anybody's listening to me and saying it, but you know, one of the things in my blog is that I track all of the lies that the Israeli military and intelligence apparatus tells about various operations that they're engaged in, and try to expose them and have a record of this deceit that they engage in.
If I can say something quickly about this discussion we're having about the destruction of the building of AP Media and Al Jazeera and also Middle East Eye, this attack on the media building, I mean, you've both offered different theories to explain how it happened, but I think we find it difficult to find the theories because it is such an irrational thing to do. Because what would possibly the Israeli the state of Israel has to gain from destroying the building? So let me offer a different interpretation for what happened. After all, the artillery or the drone that destroyed the building is operated by some soldier who knows one thing for certain. There's nothing or almost nothing they could do that would make the Israeli military investigate their decision to open fire and make them accountable if they kill innocent civilians or if they destroy Palestinian property. So somebody in the Israeli artillery, or maybe even in the intelligence, and just decided to make this building into a target. And because they don't like reportings from Al Jazeera and AP about the bombing in Gaza, and they never got approval from above to do that. And of course, because the Israeli government has this system where the soldiers are not accountable and never have to face consequences for these decisions, the responsibility still stays on their shoulders. It's still the Ministry of Defense who will have to answer to the ICC or whatever international investigation is going to happen. I'm not trying to get them off the hook, but this is what happens when the military stops functioning as a military and acts like an angry mob. Every soldier does whatever they want. By the way, I saw one of the questions, one of the recent questions in the chat is about people calling for joint solidarity, demonstrations of Jews and Palestinians together against the war. And at the very beginning of our conversation, Richard, you mentioned the slogan that has been used so often by activists in 48 Palestinians and Israeli Jews. Jews and Arabs refuse to be enemies. And I just wanted to mention that I've heard from my friends in these demonstrations this year or this time around that they don't want to use this slogan anymore, because they say, imagine we have a demonstration against violence against women, against gender-based violence, and we say men and women refuse to be enemies. That would be obscene. And under these conditions, we have to find new slogans for calling for an end to racism.
One of the things that I wanted to mention in light of what you were just saying was this video that I mentioned in Jaffa, I'm sorry, of these Israeli Jews demonstrating in this central square in Jaffa, and then trying to march down the street and being blocked by the vigilantes. It just seemed so pathetic to me that they were shouting Jews and Arabs refuse to be enemies, but it's clear that they are enemies. So it's as if they're trying to create some kind of a fantasy state of, in our little island here, we are refusing to be enemies. And I appreciate the fact that they were walking down the street and they were brave and they were trying to encourage the Palestinians who were, in the homes that were on both sides of the streets with their slogans. But it seemed so, I don't know, it's hard to describe. It seemed like an empty gesture almost. And I don't know how you have solidarity under these terms in this situation. When I went to this rally yesterday, I am a Jew, and there were Jews, I should say, at this rally, and there was even a Jew dressed in a religious prayer shawl. More power to him. And I'm glad that we were there, but we weren't there as Jews. That there was no Jew who spoke on the panel, and I don't really think that that was necessary, that would happen. But it just feels like right now, how can there be solidarity? I mean, there needs to be, but how can there be? Lubna.
I just want to say, like, I've been receiving a lot of messages from Israeli friends who wishing that this madness end and we go back to normality. And they want to make it like clear that what's normal for Israelis is not normal for Palestinians. Israelis will go back to the kind of normal of drinking the cafe in Tel Aviv beach, and the Palestinians will go back to be besieged in Gaza, to be behind the walls in the West Bank, to be Class B citizens in 48. And this is, we don't want to go back to the normal, and that's why we had the uprising. And many Israelis just don't understand this. They go hide behind the slogans like Arabs and Jewish, as you said, refuse to be enemies, end the war now, make it as if it was an equal conflict. But there is something else now. They should really understand that this is our rule of how we can, speak up and put our reality in the table, and not romanticize it as just come and eat hummus and falafel in the villages of the Arabs, and then if we behave not well, and then we become the bad ones and the ones who are not grateful. There is now a new generation, there's a new voice, and there is no compromise.
Well, I had thought that this would go for about an hour and a half, and unless anyone has anything else that they want to contribute, this might be a good time to end our panel. Shir and Lubna, is there anything else, final words that you want to say, or?
I wanted
I
to,
want
to
just
say
to
thank
say
you.
that there is one thing that we need to be really discussed: the amount of settlers who came from West Bank to inside Israel these weeks and took part in lynching and beating. They are armed, they are shooting. This is a new phenomenon we witness here. I interviewed some of these guys. They feel very relaxed to say that we should shoot the Arabs in the chest and the head. I have this filmed in a video. This is something worth attention and discussion in the future. This is a new era of reality here.
The deputy mayor of Lod actually called publicly for settlers from Yitzhar, which is one of the most radical settlements, to come and aid the Jewish residents of Lod. You know, he also, the mayor called for the army to be deployed. And I don't know if the army has ever been deployed in any civilian area in this way to put down civil uprisings, maybe since 1966. Maybe Shir or Lubna know that better. But
It was, but it's a question of scale.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, there was a border police units also in Jaffa and in other cities.
yeah, but I'm talking about the IDF itself was brought in, which is a kind of adding a different dimension, because usually the IDF is dealing with, you know, the West Bank or dealing with, you know, armed.
Maybe not everyone who hears us today knows that when I say border police, I do mean a military unit. It just has
Yeah.
the name of a police, but they are fully armored with automatic machine gun soldiers and no police training. Yes, it's part of the military.
Yeah, yeah. They're more thuggish though than the IDF. The IDF is a little more refined in the way it approaches things. But anyway, that's an added dimension.
Other than that, I just want to say thank you for this meeting. All of what's happening make me feel very hopeful. I feel for the first time that liberation, freedom, and justice is something possible, even in a peaceful way. I think we need the courage of the internationals to stand with the people in the ground. And yes, that's really, thank you, Richard and Shir, for being here, and for everyone who joined us. And it's a big thing. Everyone is doing his work, and this is a long process, and we should keep faith that we will have a better life for everyone.
Yes, it takes a lot of patience and a lot of courage, for sure, for sure. And thank you, Lubna, for giving us this unique perspective that you have to offer of being there and witnessing everything while we're kind of observers from the outside. Thank you, Shir. Shir, I think you may have had something you wanted to add.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Lubna, for being here and saying these very important things. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
And finally, I want to thank everybody who is in the audience for coming on such short notice. And I hope that we've informed you, and I hope that you can take some of the things that we've been saying and turn that into concrete action by contacting members of Congress and anybody, family, colleagues, and spreading a message that's different than what we're hearing in the media and what we're hearing from our leaders. And hopefully we can provide an alternative, dissenting alternative. And thank you, everyone, again, and goodbye for now.